first lesson on Greek civilization and Greek culture, which is often referred to as the cradle of Western civilization, and obviously referred to as the cradle of Western Civ, because that's essentially where Western Civ began. And so, much like we did with the other areas, we'll start with geography. And Greece had a relatively unique geography in comparison with the 5 early river civilizations, in that its topography was quite mountainous, did not rely on rivers. In fact, it relied more on the Mediterranean. And so as such, the Greeks were master shipbuilders, and the Mediterranean and between the islands almost served as highways, as connective trade routes between the various Greek islands. Okay? And also on the mainland part of Greece, the mountainous terrain made it such that, particularly with a lack of infrastructure, of road infrastructure, the various different Greek civilizations or city-states or polis developed quite differently and independent of each other. And so even though we talk about it as being Greek, each of the polis were Greek in that they spoke Greek and they had maybe some similar aspects and some common traits, but they also developed very unique of and from each other. And so, if you went to Corinth, civilization would look very different than if you were in Athens, for example. And looking at the two dominant polis of Greek civilization, that of Athens and Sparta, we use this as an example here. Within Athens, Athens is really the birthplace of democracy, with its founder Cleisthenes. But the Athenian democracy looks very different than how many times we perceive democracy to look today, particularly the United States representative form of democracy. Athenian democracy, all citizens were able to participate so long as you were a male and a landowner. So technically that's not all citizens. But you were to participate if you were a male and a landowner. If you were a slave, if you were a woman, if you were a peasant, if you were just a average Joe, then you were not to participate in the Athenian democracy. And so it was somewhat, you can argue, aristocratic in that sense. But they were supposed to act on behalf of all the people. And so decisions would be made by majority rule. And through all of this, there was a policy called ostracism, that if too often or too frequently someone would kind of be on the outside of the mainstream, outside of the status quo, then they would be what was referred to as ostracized, kicked out of society. Now, it'd be put to a vote. It'd be put to a vote. And if you were ostracized, then you were in exile. I guess not all that much unlike Yoda at the end of episode 3, when he has to return to Dagobah, and he is exiled essentially from Coruscant. And so very similar, if you want to draw that correlation. And why wouldn't you? It's Star Wars, it's awesome. But Athenian democracy also left it was a dangerous system, because even though it was only for a specific group of people, land-owning men, it still was far more decentralized than anything anyone had ever tried before. You had various, throughout the rest of the Mediterranean, not the Mediterranean world, but you can make that argument. But the early river civilizations, you had monarchs, possibly oligarchs. You can argue to an extent dictatorships, but it's kind of predates all of that. But never did you put the power of government in the hands of multiple people, more than just a few. Not necessarily an oligarchic situation, but in more than just a few people. Okay, democracy really is ruled by the many, and so it was dangerous in that sense, because how can you really trust the many to make the right decision, quote unquote, and whatever that might be. And so in that sense, democracy is dangerous, and that's why democracy still is dangerous today in that sense. Now, danger, don't take danger as a negative thing. Danger is a positive thing in the In fact, we've talked before about, it's the design of democracy, its intent is to be inefficient. Democracy is an inefficient form of government, but that's a good thing, because that means that people have to talk about what ultimately is best, and hopefully limit the danger that's there. And not just operate on the tyranny of the majority, so to speak. And so putting power and a say and a voice in the hands of the many certainly is a preferred system over centralizing it in one individual, even though Plato would greatly disagree and say that the philosopher king should be the one in charge, and that the people really are unfit to rule. And so that's Athens. Now, in stark contrast to that would obviously then be Sparta. And in Sparta is not going to have democracy. In fact, it is going to be an oligarchy, ruled by a few. In fact, it's going to be ruled essentially by two. You have a king of essentially the people and a king of the military, and they're both kind of equally controlling of Spartan society. Obviously, we know through the film, I'm sure some of you have probably seen 300, Spartan society was highly militaristic, and they trained their men at a young age, they trained their boys from a young age to be warriors. That's what they were trained to do and brought up to do and to be as a warrior, unafraid, and just the glory and the valor of possibly sacrificing yourself on behalf of the state. And everything in Sparta really revolved around the state. And so in that sense, one could argue that Sparta was, borderline an early fascist civilization. Now, I don't want you, there are many different types and brands of fascism, in which case, you can look up Robert O. Paxton and his 5 stages of fascism. You can read that pamphlet, I'm sure, on JSTOR or anywhere. And so the fascism that Paxton outlines, or the fascism that you saw in Germany or in Italy during World War, the time leading up to World War II, is very different than Spartan society. But I think you can definitely draw clear correlations between Spartan civilization and fascism. I think you can definitely draw correlations, and certainly contrasts as well. But it's certainly worth mentioning that there are commonalities there. All right. So next time we're going to look at again, this idea of the cradle of Western civilization.